Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and I am here for my LCS Round 3 overview and analysis of two series today. Yes, we've got two series to cover. Technically, this is my Round 3 video, but we're going to be covering Round 3 as well as the first quote-unquote semi-final Round 4 series, which is, of course, Winners Finals. So, if you guys are excited for that, let me know down in the comment section below. Obviously, a lot to talk about between these two series. One is going to decide the first team that's going to be in the finals, and the other is going to determine the final team to end up making the World Championships out of North America. So, two very, very integral and important series here for four teams that are on top. Let me know how you guys expected things to go down in the comment section below. Did things go as you expected? Were you over-impressed, under-impressed with how people were able to perform under the pressure? Let me know all of that stuff. You know I love chatting it up with you guys down below. But with that being said, let's go ahead and jump right into our analysis of these two series. I'm actually going to go a little bit out of order here. I'm going to go with the Winners Finals first. It did take place first. It was the series that happened earlier, and so I'm going to cover it earlier, even though technically it takes place later in the bracket, quote-unquote, takes place in a round after. I'm just going to cover it first to keep things chronologically sane, at least for me, but that means we're going to be talking about our Winners Finals right now, and our Winners Finals was a series between the number 2 seeded 100 Thieves and the number 5 seeded Cloud9. Now, 100 Thieves, a team that not a lot of people are really all that surprised to see here. They were incredibly consistent throughout the regular season. They've been consistent over the course of probably the past year or so. Even if they weren't as dominant in spring as they probably should have been, or as people expected them to be, they definitely were a very, very good team, and I don't think a lot of people are shocked at all to see them be the team that's sitting here in Winners Finals. However, Cloud9, on the other hand, is a team that I think a lot of people are very surprised to see in this position. They had to go through quite a few challenges to be here. First off, taking care of CLG in the first round in 5 games. Second off, being able to take care of the number 1 seeded Evil Geniuses in round 2. And both of those were pretty big upsets, I think, in consideration. Obviously, I expected Cloud9 to be able to take care of CLG, but even I did not project EG to falter so hard in the playoffs. Me, a known EG doubter, quite frankly. So, definitely something that's going to be incredibly interesting here, but the stakes for this game are entirely different than I think both of these teams have been used to throughout the playoffs. Both have now officially qualified for Worlds, and now they are just fighting for that LCS trophy. So, a big game, still definitely an important one, but both have had probably their biggest concerns wiped away. They will both be going to the World Championships. So, which team is going to be moving on to Grand Finals? Which one is going to have to make their way through the losers bracket to get their rematch? Well, we got to start game by game with, of course, game number 1. And game number 1 was won by Cloud9. They are able to take the first game here. Very, very surprising. I think me and a lot of other people saw this as a pretty easy series for 100 Thieves. So for Cloud9 to be able to take this game 1, very, very good for their momentum. And in the way they did it, definitely very, very hype. Obviously, if you didn't watch it, it ended in a backdoor, which is always, always fun. You're never going to hear me complain about that, but definitely an interesting game up until that point. 100T actually had a decent amount of control in this game through the early to mid game. A lot of it because Abadage just got so far ahead in the mid lane on this Azir pick. Obviously, I've been talking a little bit how I think Jensen has been typically a little bit overrated as a mid laner in the region so far this year. And especially in lane, I think he's quite poor in lane, or at least he has been over the course of this split. That's something that I think has carried over from his time on Team Liquid last year, where he was a very bad laner up until the World Championships for that Team Liquid team. But Abadage comes in here on the Azir, playing into the Orianna. Obviously, a pick that Jensen has pulled out multiple times now. I've talked about it on this channel. I don't think Ori is all that strong just in general, but Abadage really is able to take advantage of that pick here on the Azir. Has a ton more pressure in lane, is able to roam a lot with his jungler closer to be able to generate a lot of early leads. Hell, he's even able to play around objectives a lot better. Overall, Abadage just does a great job of absolutely stifling Jensen in the mid lane and really generating a huge lead for 100T in general. Some of that off the back, of course, of closer playing well, but we'll get to the jungle matchup in a bit. And then some of that off the back of FBI and Huhi also just playing relatively okay here. You get the Sivir handshake. This is something that we talk about a lot on this channel. Very, very common across pretty much every league right now. FBI plays a Sivir fine. Huhi is relatively impactful on the Yuumi in this matchup. You're going into the Zeri Renata, a very, very aggressive lane, one that really does have to kind of punish in order to generate nearly as much of a lead as Zeri would with, something like a Yuumi as the support. But overall, it still ended up working out. But for Cloud9, the reason they were able to get back into this game so sufficiently is because of Blabber on this Wukong, who had a really, really phenomenal mid game on the Wukong and a late game. I'll get to that, but a really, really phenomenal mid-game for Blabber here, really being able to out-jungle Closer at pretty much every opportunity, even though a lot of his lanes really weren't going all that well. You had the bot lane, which I do think was pretty positive for you. You could definitely invest into that Zeri, which he did early in order to generate a lot of gold down to Berserker, which is great. When Berserker and Sven are able to win lane, they're a huge, huge presence throughout the rest of the game. And then I think Fudge was in a pretty decent spot in the top lane against the Aatrox anyways, but Blabber was really able to take over the macro part of the game, really just outplaying Closer for a majority of this game number one, and he really, really came in clutch towards the back half of this game, where it really looked like he was getting caught out towards the back half here. 100 Thieves was really chasing, and then he has this amazing play to just completely turn it, go all the way in, ultimate, and really, set everything up for Berserker to be able to knock everyone down towards the back half of this game. If Blabber doesn't have that aggressive mentality in his head, I'm not sure he tries to make that play. And I'm not sure Cloud9 has an easy chance to win this game, but he does make that play, and it very much works out. You have Fudge on the backline. You've got Berserker doing a ton of damage on this Zeri towards the back half of this game. And then, of course, it ends in a backdoor. Blabber's my player of the game, by the way. I don't think I said that. Game one player of the game for me was Blabber on this Wukong, but of course you have the backdoor, which wasn't Blabber, it wasn't Fudge, it was Jensen on this Orianna, which is probably the last pick I think I would have expected to see as the backdoor option for this Cloud9 comp, but it still worked effectively, mostly because I think 100T forgot about Jensen so much because he was so irrelevant for a majority of this game that they forgot about him even to the point where he was taking the base, but it was also a ridiculously risky call for Jensen to go for that. If he doesn't get that and he dies there, they, quite frankly, probably lose the game at that point because they can't stop the 5v4 push down into their base. They probably just straight up lose. So a very, very gutsy call for Jensen that ends up working out. He is definitely rewarded for the play, and honestly, you love to see it. You love to see players taking risks, taking shots at the enemy team here. Obviously, when they work, you look like an absolute hero. If it doesn't work, you look like an absolute moron, but luckily for Jensen, we don't get to see that part here. Even if he didn't play all that well through the majority of this game, obviously, he is technically the reason that they're sitting here with a game one win, so you gotta be happy about that. As for 100 Thieves, like I said, they had control for a lot of this game, mostly because Abadage just had a phenomenal early game. Unfortunately, Closer just got out jungled in the mid game and really wasn't able to keep up with a lot of what Blabber was doing. Towards the back half, he was really attempting to force plays. I think around team fights was really trying to force confrontations between himself and Cloud9 just in general, and it honestly got them in trouble. Blabber with that re-engage towards the back half of the game that basically wiped 100T to put Cloud9 right back on level when it came to gold. He really wasn't all that good in this game, and you really need someone like Closer to step up if you want to be able to maintain a stranglehold in this series. You also have Someday in the top lane on his best champion in the Aatrox. I would really like to see some investment into him. Obviously, Aatrox is a pick that I think can be really, really impactful towards the back half of this game in a similar way to what Kennen ends up offering for your team, where obviously Kennen likes to flank, be on the back line, likes to separate those two lines, create that divide, as I like to call it. Aatrox does a very, very similar thing. In fact, I think he does it more directly than someone like Kennen does, where he wants to sit right in between that line of the front line and the back line, making sure the back line doesn't really have any targets or any way to get on anybody in the mid ground, and the front line doesn't really have any backup, any damage at that point. So really, I think the Aatrox pick can be absolutely huge. Unfortunately, wasn't invested into at all in this game, and Someday was unfortunately punished for that. So he's going to get my dud of the game in game number one. But overall, 100T, not the worst game in the world. You definitely jumped out to an early lead. If you were able to keep that, if you played the mid to late game just a tad bit better, if you got maybe a little bit of a better performance from your jungler here in Closer, maybe FBI had a little bit more gold, I definitely think you had a shot to end this game pretty easily. Obviously, even if you stop the back door, at that point, you're probably in a decent spot. So it really was an incredibly close game that both teams could have taken. Unfortunately for 100T, they couldn't take this one. But good for Cloud9, definitely a good momentum builder. You're gonna have to shore up some of your lanes, obviously. That's been one of the biggest problems with this Cloud9 team all year long, is the fact that they just don't consistently win early. If they can start doing that a little bit more consistently, obviously, Jensen needs to step up. He can't have more games like this. Fudge, I think, needs to step up him going into Sunday, arguably the two best top laners in the region right now. If Blabber can continue to play like this, if Berserker and Sven can continue to rock and roll in the early game like this, Cloud9 should be able to translate this lead into a series win. But is that going to be able to happen in game number 2? Obviously, a big one here. 2-0 up in the series is pretty huge, so definitely something to consider there. You definitely don't want to go down 0-2 in the playoffs. So is Cloud9 going to be able to get that stranglehold of the series, or is 100T going to be able to even things out? Well, the winner of game number 2 was 100 Thieves. They are able to take game number 2 here, tie the series up at 1-1. Very, very important. Obviously, going down 0-2 isn't nearly as deadly this year in playoffs as it has been in years past, but it still is not a great place to be in. 100 Thieves very, very narrowly avoiding that here by taking this game towards the back half. A pretty solid one from 100T, and in a lot of the ways that they were able to win in the regular season, at least consistently, which is to say through 2 of their best players and then somebody else stepping up. Someday, Huhi, both phenomenal in this game. They've been the best players on 100T all year long, in my opinion. Obviously, FBI probably in that conversation as well, but Someday and Huhi were really, really good in this game. Huhi went really, really down in the early game here on the Amumu. Obviously, a pick that I talk about a lot on this channel, a very feast or famine pick, something that can work, something that might not work as well, but in this game, it definitely worked out towards the back half. The good thing about Amumu is that if you get behind early, really the only thing that you're losing is technically tank stats, but if the enemy has no time to blow you up, if you still have damage on your side, the CC late game is still going to be impactful. His job doesn't really change all that much whether he's ahead or behind. Another reason why I don't love him as a pick, but in that way, like if he does get behind, you can really still accentuate a lot of his strengths towards the back half of the game, and I think Huhi did that very well even after going down really, really hard in the early game. And then Someday on this Gwen was doing an unreal amount of damage towards the end of this game. Very, very impressive. Usually you don't see the Gwen top lane really be the hyper carry for a comp, but you have the Kalista, you have the Talia, more secondary carry types, obviously the Poppy in the jungle. Gwen really took that role. Someday really took that role of being the main guy here for 100 Thieves, and he's taken that a lot this year. I think people have really underestimated how good Someday is. I know he was pretty high in the MVP voting, but to me, he was number 2, and he was a very close number 2 to Inspired, in my opinion, in the MVP voting. He was phenomenal this year. Another really good game from him. And then you had another great performance from Abadage in the mid lane. Really, really important that he steps up in this series. Jensen, I think, has definitely shown some cracks, most specifically in the early to mid game throughout the year, and especially in this series so far. If Abadage can step up and really be a big focal point for 100 Thieves, I think that actually could be a huge power point of the map for the team throughout the entirety of the series. He picks up the Talia in this game, obviously a pick more known for its supportive ability rather than its ability to carry, but I talk about this a lot on the channel. Talia still does a lot of damage. It's not like she can't hurt you. She just needs a little bit of a jump start in order to get there. Abadage gets super duper far ahead in this game again and gets to the point on the Talia where he's able to carry the game pretty easily. He's a pretty easy choice for my player of the game here in game number 2. Closer and FBI were fine. Not really focal points, just good players. It was really about Someday, Abadage, and Huhi for 100 Thieves. For Cloud9, on the other hand, this certainly wasn't the same kind of team that showed up in game number 1. For the big part, Blabber just wasn't the same player that he was in game number 1 here on the Wukong. He was significantly less impactful early in the game. He was taking those risks, but they just often were not paying off. However, a lot of the rest of the game actually went relatively similarly. Fudge and Someday in the top lane was a relatively neutral matchup for a while. That's kind of what you get with the Ornn in the top lane. That's really the reason you pick it, but eventually Someday just played so much better towards the back half of this game than Fudge did, being able to take over the game a lot on this Gwen, being the highest damage player in the game, and Fudge really wasn't going to be able to ever match that on the Ornn. Berserker and Sven did not nearly get out to the same kind of lead that they did, although Berserker did get quite a bit of gold on the Aphelios early from some misplays on Huhi's part, but like I said, he was really able to make up for that later with some really good engages that really stopped this Aphelios and even this Renata from really being all that impactful, even with the Renata ult, right? A lot of situations, you can see that Renata go behind early and still be really, really good because the ultimate is so versatile and so useful just in general. But in this game, it just wasn't meant to be really at all. And then you got to talk about the mid lane matchup here. Jensen and Abadage. Abadage outclasses him for the second game in a row. Jensen, game 1 goes to a very, very much a comfort pick on the Orianna. Game 2 goes to another comfort pick here on the Anivia. 2 picks that really aren't all that meta right now, and neither really worked out. I know a lot of people really liked Cloud9's draft in this game, and I can definitely see an idea of what could happen here, but the problem is if you don't have that early game pressure on the side of Cloud9, then you're just simply not going to be able to scale in the way that you're going to want to here with Ornn, Anivia, and Aphelios. And unfortunately for C9, that's basically exactly what happened, is the Taliyah was able to create so much more on the map than the Anivia ever was. Even with the Mumu going down early, they were still able to make plays because Kallista's damage is so much higher than Aphelios' for the first 15 minutes of the game. And then Gwen got to the point where even the Ornn wasn't really going to be able to actively stop her without, like, tanking the rest of his game against something like a Kallista. And so, overall, a lot of this game was going to be on Blabber for Cloud9, because if he was able to generate that early lead, if he was able to out-jungle Closer like he did in game number 1, they were going to have a shot, because the rest of their lanes do scale relatively well, and their team fight can potentially be really, really strong with the group that they have here. But unfortunately, Blabber did not show up like he did in game number 1, so he is going to get my dud of the game in game number 2 here. Obviously, from player of the game in game 1 to dud of the game in game 2, it happens more than you think in these playoffs. But overall, I would say a decent game for Cloud9. Definitely not perfect, but one that I think you can rebound from. If you just get better early performances, you just need to hold up in lane, and Cloud9's going to be in a good spot. 100 Thieves are going to be happy that they're able to tie up the series, though. And now we're basically just looking at a best of 3 here, and honestly, pretty much anybody can win a best of 3 at this level, especially two teams that are as good as these two are. You only got to win 2 of 3, and I think both teams are certainly capable of doing so. So who is going to take that big 2-1 series lead here in game number 3? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Cloud9. They are able to take game number 3 and put themselves back into the driver's seat in this series against 100T. Really shocking everybody, me included. I did not think the C9 team really had the talent to be able to keep up with a lot of the top teams in North America, mostly because, and I mean this, usually I praise this, but I'll get to why I think this is a bad thing in a bit. They just don't play meta. Like, they can't play meta. There is a lot of things that, you know, they have run into throughout the year. They tried to play meta, and they were an average team at best. That really, this team has unlocked a lot of what they're able to do and able to accomplish by moving away from some of the strong picks in the meta and moving to some of the stuff that we've seen around the world that's been considered much, much weaker. Luckily for them, they're just able to pilot it a lot better than the opponents that they're playing against. Really, really encapsulated by my player of the game in game number 3 here, which is going to be Jensen on the LeBlanc. This is a pick that I've talked about quite frequently on the channel, not being all that good right now in pro, and I stick by that. I think she's probably one of the more, one of the less impactful, actual playable meta assassins in the mid lane right now. When you're talking about Ahri, when you're talking about Sylas, when you're talking about Akali, like, those three can really impact the game on a level that I think LeBlanc just doesn't have the ability to do unless she's super far ahead right now. But Jensen played a really, really good game here in game number 3, which is really good to see because obviously he was a pretty big problem for this team in both game 1 and game 2. Now, game 1, obviously, he ended up winning with the backdoor, but he was incredibly useless that entire game. Outside of that, on the Orianna, game 2 was not good from Jensen on the Anivia. Pulls out another pocket pick here in the LeBlanc and is able to make good of it. Really was the driving force for a lot of the early aggression for Cloud9 in this game and ended up ending the game, pretty late anyways. Obviously, we'll talk about, the stagnation that I think Cloud9 had in a bit because I don't think it was entirely his fault. But, the pick does end up falling off at a point even when you are ahead, and I think we saw that in the mid game. A lot of credit to Fudge in the top lane here on the Gnar. Really, really good game from him. He's actually had a really good series against Someday so far. Obviously, Someday's a good player, but Fudge has really been solid into him. Someday was pretty clearly the #1 top laner in North America this split, in my opinion. I really don't think it was all that close, if I'm being honest. But Fudge in the first 3 games, I think, obviously, Someday won game 2, but games 1 and 3 have definitely gone in Fudge's direction, and I'm not sure whether to say that's just like game state or if Fudge really is emerging as one of the best top laners in the region. We've kind of been waiting on that, and I put Fudge as my #2 top laner in North America over the course of the regular split. I think he's really shown up here in playoffs as well, and another really good game from him on the Gnar into Someday's classic Aatrox pick. It's not often that you see 2 games in a row that Someday gets to play Aatrox, and he doesn't really make an impact in either of them. And then credit to Berserker and Sven, who really just outplayed FBI, and Huhi, obviously, you're playing the Zeri Lulu into the Lucian Nami. We've seen this around the world, that the Lucian Nami can actually be a very effective way to make sure that the Zeri doesn't get online nearly as easily as she would in a lot of other scenarios. And unfortunately for FBI and Huhi, they just didn't really make a lot of proactive plays in the early game, the time of the game that you really need to put Zeri down. And Berserker was able to get to this point in the game, even though he wasn't all that fed. He was still relatively strong because he had a good amount of CS, and he wasn't behind the Lucian or anything like that. He was on pace. And Berserker was able to impact that late game team fight in a really, really impactful way. Even if it wasn't like the most crazy game from Berserker, his positioning throughout the game was really, really impressive. And a good game from Sven as well. I do want to talk about Blabber for a bit because I do think we're sitting here looking at a 31-minute game because the pacing was just significantly too slow. You hit a point in the game where all your gold is on this LeBlanc and you really need to take advantage of it, but the problem is that LeBlanc really doesn't one-shot people, which is a little bit of an issue because she's an assassin and that's kind of her job, but she really doesn't. She doesn't have the damage to one-shot people in this meta, so you're just kind of sitting at a point where you don't really want to risk it all for a team fight that you don't guarantee win, but you also don't want to, like, just sit there and not do anything because you have a lead, and you do outscale this comp. Like, I'll get to 100 Thieves in a bit, but you definitely have the scaling comp, and you had the mid-game lead, but it just took a little bit longer than I would have wanted to finish the game. Blabber ends up saying, like, F it, just, like, runs it down, goes in at the end of the game. They end up winning the fight and winning the game because of it, but obviously Blabber, I think at some point was just like, screw it, I'm just gonna go in. Like, we're never gonna get the play that we're looking for, and so I respect that, but this game probably took a little bit longer than it had to. Overall, good win for Cloud9, definitely a good bounce back game for Jensen, excited to see that, and it's, it's good to see him, feeling good on the comfort picks, although I would feel a lot better if he was pulling out things like the Ahri and the Akali and looking really, really good on that, but if he's gonna pull an Anivia ban in draft, like, that's already a plus. So, as for 100 Thieves, not a great game. They draft a super early game comp here with Wukong, Ahri, Lucian, Nami, and then don't really do anything in the early game. It's very, very frustrating, I think, as a viewer to watch this, where it's like, okay, well, this team's pretty good, and they've shown a propensity to be able to generate their own leads. Like, Closer's a very active jungler, typically. He hasn't been nearly as much this split, but, it's Closer, it's the playoffs, he's someone who I think is going to step up and really make some plays. And then you draft Wukong, Ahri, Lucian, Nami, and you're like, okay, their entire goal is to make sure that they get to the mid-game with as big of a lead as possible so they can just snowball the game out of control. I like this idea. I think snowballing in the current meta is a very, very good strategy. But they draft this comp and then proceed to play it very, very safe in the early game, especially around that bottom lane, which really needed to get ahead. You're playing Lucian, Nami into Zeri, Lulu. That is a lane where Lucian, Nami definitely needs to generate that lead basically on their own, or else you're in a position where you're just not going to have the damage to keep up. And that's exactly what happened. FBI and Huhi played it very slow, and you essentially got to the point in the game where Berserker and Sven were stronger, even essentially with no kills on them, which is never the point that you want to be in as an AD carry. And so my dud of the game is going to go to FBI here on the Lucian. I think realistically you could give this to Huhi. On the Nami, I think realistically you could give this to Closer on the Wukong. All three of them were significantly too passive in the early game and really shut down 100 Thieves' chances at generating that lead that they so desperately needed with this team comp. I really do like the idea that you're going for with 100T. There was just no execution. Obviously, Someday also just lost in the top lane, but it wasn't entirely his fault. He was the one player on this team that was kind of designed from draft to not get resources. He's the Aatrox in a team full of people that need early resources, and so he was going to be left a little bit on an island, and obviously the Gnar matchup isn't as easy as it would seem. You just wanted to see him get to the late game relatively even. He wasn't able to do that perfectly, but he also wasn't super far behind. I see a lot of people really criticizing Someday for the first couple games in this set. I really don't think they're entirely his fault. Game 1 was a little bit rough, but Game 3, obviously, he's the one who's going to absorb a lot of the pressure here, being the quote-unquote late-game influence of this draft. I more so blame Closer, FBI, and Huhi for just not doing anything in the early game, allowing Cloud9 to be more proactive on the LeBlanc, on the Poppy, and generating that lead. And overall, I think that's just, that's an indictment on what 100 Thieves has been doing over the course of this split. Closer has been significantly less active in the early game, just in general, I think, over the course of this year, and I think it really came back to bite the team here. So what does this mean for the outlook? Well, now you need to win both of the final 2 games if you are 100 Thieves. That's not the ideal position that you would want to find yourself in, but it is a situation that I think this team can accomplish. We've seen plenty of teams go down 2-1 and come back to at least push it to a Game 5, nonetheless win Game 5. We've seen so many reverse sweeps, so many comebacks in the playoffs so far. I wouldn't put it past this 100 Thieves team to just be able to do that against Cloud9, a team that really hasn't shown the same level of consistency that someone like 100 Thieves has. But Cloud9's really clicking on all cylinders. If Jensen can win lane, I actually think this Cloud9 team has a really decent chance to be able to take the last few games here. Blabber has been really consistently better than Closer. Fudge and Someday I think is really a push, but Berserker and Sven have really shown a propensity to be able to play better than FBI and Huhi in this series, and if Jensen can really step up and be that guy in the mid lane, Cloud9, I think, has a pretty good chance to be able to take this series home. But are they going to be able to do it in 4 games, or will 100 Thieves push us to a Silver Scrapes game number 5? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Cloud9. They are able to do it. They take game number 4 over 100 Thieves, and they make their way to the LCS Summer Finals for the first time since 2019. It's actually insane, and you have to be excited for this crew. They absolutely deserve it. They played a really, really good series here overall. Actually bounced back really well from some questionable early games in the series. I would say through the first 2, it very much felt like 100 Thieves was the better team and had control over it, but games 3 and 4 were a completely different story for Cloud9 entirely. Game 3, Jensen really stepped up on the LeBlanc, was able to create a lot of early pressure, and 100 Thieves weren't able to accentuate their comp in the way that they needed to. Game number 4 here was really just a Cloud9 win. They were just the better team overall, and you've got to be incredibly excited for them, most specifically because a lot of the players that stepped up in this series were the ones that you were kind of questioning. Most notably, Jensen in the mid lane. Obviously, he definitely had some rough first 2 games here, got destroyed by Abadage in lane in the first 2, but games 3 and 4 were absolutely huge for him. He was able to pull bans on a lot of his signature champions, things like the Anivia last game, things like the LeBlanc as a first rotation ban this game, which is absolutely huge overall. And he's still able to pick up something that is relatively meta in the Azir, a pick that I do think is pretty good right now and is definitely playable at a high level. And he's able to execute on it really, really well. Blabber does invest into that mid lane again to make sure that Jensen's in a pretty good spot, and he definitely rewards the rest of the team by basically just carrying them at the end here to a win. A good player of the game in game number 3, an even better one, in my opinion, in game number 4 here for Jensen. But it wasn't just him. Blabber played this game so aggro on the Trundle. This is exactly what I wanted to see out of this Cloud9 team. Blabber, obviously, a player that is known for F-it plays, if you will, where he just kind of goes in and hopes things go well. He tries to outplay his opponents. I want to see him trying to do that because his mechanical skill really is exceptional. If he can refine that and become a little bit more calculated, he's going to become one of the best junglers in the world, and he's slowly becoming that. He absolutely abused Closer in this series, in my opinion. He was simply just better by a considerable margin. A really good game 4 from him. He was able to get Jensen ahead, really able to accelerate his development very quickly on that Azir to the point where he was able to carry in the late game, and then he was also a big help towards Berserker in the bottom lane on this Neela pick that we've seen be really feast or famine just generally throughout pretty much all of the playoffs in any region. Berserker is able to pilot it really well. Blabber is really able to enable it. And then you've got the Camille in the top lane going into the Aatrox again. Someday loses 3 straight games of Aatrox in this playoff series. That's ginormous for Cloud9 to have on their resume because honestly, like, not a lot of teams have really consistently been able to beat Someday's Aatrox. For them to do it 3 games in a row is absolutely great. Fudge played a phenomenal series here. Not only was he just better than Someday in this series, but he did it on multiple different champions, on multiple different playstyles. Whether it was the Kennen, whether it was the Camille, he was always able to show up and do something really, really impactful. Even on the Ornn, when he didn't win in game 2, he was still relatively important to the game overall. His team was behind, so the tank duty didn't really matter, but Fudge played really, really well in this series, and then so did Berserker and Sven. Berserker's scoreline looks a little bit troll, but that's because he's playing a champion that really does have to go in to do a lot of damage, but man, he did some damage in this game number 4 on the Neela. That champion can really, really hurt from ahead, and we definitely saw that in this game, but overall, just a phenomenal series from Cloud9. You have to be excited about this team peaking at the exact right time. This is the best that they have looked all split without any question in my mind. It is a very, very easy thing to say that, and I really, really hope that they can keep it up all the way to an LCS trophy. As for 100 Thieves, definitely a rough loss here. This was a team that I think a lot of people had favorited to walk their way into the LCS finals, but they aren't able to take care of business against Cloud9. Not the end of the world here, but they did just kind of get outplayed here in game number 4. Closer is going to get my dud of the game here on the Wukong. He picks up something that he does need to be a little bit aggro on early. You've got the Seraphine, you've got the Zeri. Obviously, you want to scale with the rest of this comp. Wukong just doesn't do all that much. He gets out jungle by Blabber early, make sure that Jensen's in a good spot. Abbedagge can't really recover on the Seraphine flex pick that they throw into the mid lane. He's clearly not all that experienced on it. Huhi has been picking up this pick a lot for 100 Thieves over the course of the split, but it seemed they wanted to try and confuse Cloud9 by flexing that into the mid lane here. Unfortunately, it very much did not work. Abbedagge just couldn't pilot it nearly to the level that he needed to. FBI did get quite a few kills under his belt, quite a bit of gold under his belt, but it's basically Zeri versus the entire Cloud9 team at that point, and you're just not going to be able to survive. Even if Huhi is there to protect you a tad bit, it's just not going to be enough to win you this game. So overall, definitely a little concerning for 100 Thieves. They did look like a pretty good team through the first 2 games of this series, but games 3 and 4 really were decisive in Cloud9's favor, and that does raise some questions. Like, where is this team at in terms of talent level, in terms of consistency level? The players that I was concerned about in the regular season, being Closer and Abbedagge, obviously had up and down series. Closer had, in my opinion, the worst series of anybody on 100T. Here, I think he was definitely the one that was outclassed most consistently. And that's definitely a little concerning because he probably had his worst year in North America in summer, or his worst split, in my opinion, and his least dominant at the very least. He was probably the least important player on 100T in the regular season, and I think that's really coming through in the playoffs. He's really going to have to step up his game if he wants to make LCS finals now. You're really relying a lot on FBI and Huhi in this series, and unfortunately, Berserker and Sven were simply just better, and that's going to be a problem that I think this 100T is going to run into against better teams, is I think they really do rely on their talent gap a lot of the time, and they're really able to take advantage of that in the LCS, where they really are one of the most talented teams. But I'm not sure how that's going to hold up on an international level. I'd like to see some development from this team as they go down to losers bracket now. Now, their season is certainly not over yet. They are qualified for the World Championships, but they still have losers finals to play. They're going to be playing the winner of the series that we're going to cover next. The winner of that will obviously go on to face Cloud9 in the LCS finals, so they still have a chance to be lifting that LCS trophy and going to Worlds as the #1 seed, but they certainly have quite a few things to fix before they get there. Congratulations to Cloud9 on their absolutely huge series win. Jensen is going to get my player of the series. It was a little bit of a tough decision. I was very much considering Blabber for this award because it really felt like he was the most consistent member of Cloud9. But even though Jensen really kind of ran it in the first 2 games, I think he was the most impactful in games 3 and 4, which were their big wins. And you got to give him credit. He did win basically game 1 by himself with that backdoor. So Jensen's going to get my player of the series, with Blabber getting a very, very close second place in that regard. But basically everybody on Cloud9 stepped up today. If they can play like this, they should be the favorites to win the LCS title, no matter who they're facing in that finals. Alright, now that we finished up our first series overview, it is time to go on to our second series of my Round 3 video, this being the actual Round 3 series, and the series to determine the third and final, I should say, team to go to Worlds representing the LCS and North America, at home this year in NA. Worlds is there, so who is going to be the third and final team representing the region? Is it going to be the #1 seeded Evil Geniuses, or the #3 seeded Team Liquid? It is pretty insane to me that one of these 2 teams is on the verge of missing the World Championships, because you look at the 2 and how they've gone throughout the year. These were probably the 2 that I was most comfortable with heading to the World Championships, especially after spring. EG should be pretty obvious. This is the team that won Spring Split, went to MSI, didn't have a great performance, but still played okay, was able to take a game off of eventual MSI winners RNG, and that's pretty good. That's a pretty good situation to be in. Plus, they really made their way through the playoffs in a good state, and they were the #1 seed in the regular season, even though they did have a few moments in the regular season where they weren't able to beat some of the top teams, teams like TL, teams like 100 Thieves. They still, for the most part, were consistent enough to be able to beat pretty much everybody really, really easily, and this is a team that is shown to be able to step up in clutch times like the playoffs in the last split. As for TL, this is the super team of the LCS. They have the biggest budget, the biggest roster, and if they don't make Worlds, that is a colossal disappointment for either one of these teams to not win this series, it is going to be an incredible failure on them for the year. So which team is going to be the one that is knocked out of playoffs and out of Worlds contention here today? Well, we're going to go through it game by game, of course, starting with game number 1. And game number 1 was an EG win. Evil Geniuses is able to take game number 1, a super important and crucial game in a best of 5, in my opinion, maybe the most important, maybe other than game 3 or game 4. But game 1 is absolutely huge. Momentum being on your side is really big in a series like this, and EG really stepped up to the plate and played a pretty good game. It wasn't the cleanest of all time, but they were able to avoid a lot of the traps that they've fallen into throughout the season against some of the better teams, most notably early deaths. We've seen quite a bit in the bot lane just in general from both of these players early in games against good teams. They're very aggressive as a duo, and they can sometimes be punished for that. I do want to make a note before we get into any talk about this series. I am going to talk about the series freely, like I'm not going to mince my words in any way, but much love out there to Danny. Obviously, I'm recording this on the 7th of September, which means that yesterday we learned about Danny's mental health situation and everything revolving that. And I know, obviously, League media hasn't been the most kind to Danny, at least in consistent states, and so I'm not going to sit here and praise Danny where he doesn't get it, but it's something I'm going to keep in mind, I think, throughout this overview. Not that he's ever going to watch it, but just trying not to spread the cycle of hate that I think has been going around, I think, for a long time for a lot of these players. Just something I'm going to keep in mind. It's not going to affect too much of what I talk about, but, you know, with everything going on, I just figured I'm not going to be one to jump on top of that or anything. And so with that, I'm still going to talk about this game, and Danny did a really good job of being able to absorb that pressure in the early game. Like I said, honestly, this bot lane can sometimes be a little bit over-aggressive and can be taken advantage of, but most of the time, they're very consistent. They've never really been all that lane dominant, but that's okay, because they're both such phenomenal team fighters, arguably the two best team fighters in the region at their roles, at least this split. And I think that makes, like, you get enough players on this team to make up for it, that it's fine. JoJo's a very lane-dominant player. Inspired is a very early-game dominant player. Impact can be lane-dominant depending on the pick that he's on. And this draft really incentivizes, I think, a variety of styles of play. I think this is a very, 2020 style draft. This is a draft that I don't think I would have very much expected to see this year. It's very much a throwback, but everybody on the team really performs it well. You have the Gangplank and the Azir for the late game. Hell, even the Senna is going to be doing a good amount of damage in the late game. And then you have a lot of peel, you have a lot of protect with the Jarvan, with the Tahm Kench, a lot of things on this team that are going to enable those quote-unquote carries to be able to do their job a lot easier. My biggest concern for a team like this would be in a meta where macro game early is very, very important. I can see a world in which TL is able to take advantage of the slowness, quote-unquote, of what a lot of EG is doing here. Gangplank isn't particularly quick to the draw. Azir certainly is not, especially into something like an Akali. And then the Senna, not so much either. They all need a little bit of time to ramp up. Luckily for them, looking at TL's draft, they're also not very quick to the draw. It's really just the junglers that can do anything in the early game. Even then, it's really just Trundle who has that early game impact. Both Inspired and Santorin kind of got all their stuff off. Nothing was really all that different between the two of them with how they played. They both were fairly good in the early game, but the difference maker was definitely the mid lane matchup here. JoJo versus Bjergsen. One of the most interesting matchups we could have possibly had in the playoffs. The young rookie hotshot, NA wonder kid, whatever you want to call him, JoJo Pyun in the mid lane, taking on probably the best player in LCS history in Bjergsen for the final spot at Worlds. It's a great storyline, and JoJo definitely wins the first battle here. He gets on the Azir, Bjergsen gets on the Akali. Now, obviously, we know Bjergsen's Akali can be incredibly disgusting. We saw that in 2020 on TSM multiple times, but this was not a very good game from Bjergsen overall. He was really, I think, a big part of why I felt more confident in TL's draft in game number 1 is because that Akali has significantly more agency in that mid lane in terms of being able to roam to objective fights, being able to influence other lanes than something like an Azir, which I do criticize in this meta pretty frequently on this channel for being a pick that, yes, it does scale incredibly well, and you can do a ton of damage on that champion in the late game, but the early game isn't nearly as safe as it used to be because it's not really about laning phase anymore in the mid lane. And That was something I was definitely going to be concerned about for JoJo, but Bjergsen played it so safe and so passive. He really didn't do anything in this game, and it was definitely disappointing. JoJo was very much able to take advantage of the passiveness coming out from Bjergsen and was able to really dominate the back half of this game, so much so that it was a pretty easy choice for player of the game in game number 1 going to JoJo Pume. You got to give a lot of credit to Impact in the top lane on this Gangplank as well. Obviously, going into Bwipo, somebody that has been... You were able to take advantage of Bwipo, like, quite frankly. Like, he's a good player and he's able to win on his own, but there are also matchups where he is going to overextend and he's going to ego pick, and you are going to be able to take advantage of him if you are a good top laner. Impact, as we know, is a good top laner, even if he is having one of his worst splits in quite a while. He was able to take advantage of it here. The Gangplank coming out, a pick we're really not seeing all that much. It's kind of faded a little bit out of the meta as we've come to playoff time, but Impact is one of the best Gangplanks we have in North America, and he proved it in this game, a really, really solid one. Danny and Vulcan, very much that supportive lane duo that I think really accelerated a lot of the rest of the team. If you don't want a lot of the pressure on Danny and Vulcan, I think Senna Tahm Kench is actually a really productive lane for them to play. They can be really, really aggressive in lane because Tahm Kench really can do a lot if you don't give him space and if you don't respect his ability to go in and damage you and set Senna up for a lot of kills, especially if Jarvan is there. And Senna can be really, really safe, and she's going to scale infinitely into that late game with range. Her damage is going to be really good, or if you want to build her more support, you can really do either. Overall, I think if you want to play away from that bot lane, Senna Tahm Kench is something that I would expect EG to go to more often, but this was really the Impact and JoJo show, and I think EG showed that in this game. As for TL, like I said, Bjergsen just needed to do more. Santorin actually had a pretty decent early game, just like Inspired. He was able to move around the map, was able to influence a lot of the bot lane here. Hansama was able to generate a bit of gold on this Jinx, which has very clearly become his comfort pick in this meta. Obviously, Draven not banned out in this game, but Jinx has really become like the pick for Hansama. I'm not sure if that's going to stick. Obviously that, the Draven, the Seraphine, the things that they've gone to, I think the most over the course of the year, but Jinx definitely an interesting pick, and Santorin wanted to play around that, wanted to make sure that Jinx could get online to control the late game, but you're really relying a lot on your Akali to be able to do a lot in that solo lane in order to make that happen, and unfortunately, Bjergsen did not have a good one. He is going to be my dud of the game in game number 1. You just need to see significantly more from him. And then there's Bwipo in the top lane on Gragas. We see this out of Bwipo. We've seen it multiple times in the playoffs. It's the reason they're sitting here in loser's bracket is because when he loses hard, and he lost this game. 1-6-2 on the Gragas, not very good. Gragas isn't all that good in the meta right now. I get it. Bwipo is one of the best Gragases in the world, but I mean, when you don't have a lot of backup, Gragas is a champion that you can really take advantage of, especially with somebody like Gangplank, who is really easy to peel off of Gragas. Basically, he just takes the body slam and then W's out and just leaves. If he gets one barrel chain off on you, you can no longer do anything in that laning phase, and so don't really love the matchup overall for Bwipo, but generally, he just needs to play better. I've always said, and we've proven this in TL's previous series, Bwipo is better on tanks for this team. He is less volatile, and he gives the other players on the team more of an opportunity to carry the game without the top laner being a massive problem. We saw it in the series against CLG. We saw it in the series against 100 Thieves. We're probably going to see it again in the series against CG. It's going to be an interesting matchup, but certainly both teams, I think, can bounce back and can get into decent spots. If TL wins Game 2, we're basically looking at a fresh series, a best of 3. But if EG wins Game 2, obviously it's still not over then. TL has gone down 0-2 in both of their last 2 series. One of them they've gone back to win. Both of them they brought at least to game number 5. And so TL is definitely not a team that is going to go down without a fight, but EG is definitely going to have to maintain hold of their lane dominance that they kind of showed in this game, especially their solo lanes, in order to continue the push forward. So, is EG going to be able to get that 2-0 lead, or is TL going to buck the trend of their recent playoff series and actually win game number 2? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Team Liquid. They are able to pick up the game 2 win, which is super important for their series. Obviously, maybe not as important as some other teams because they've shown a propensity to be resilient and to be able to come back from a deficit, but it's still never good to go down 0-2 in a series, and they are able to fight their way back into it here with a really, really dominant win. Honestly, they were just the better team in this game from moment 1, and a lot of it was just better macro. Gotta give a lot of respect to Impact in the top lane. He had to 3v1 the entire game up in that lane, and he honestly did valiantly, but at the end of the day, there's only so much you can do when your team's just not really responding to a lot of the pressure that is being sent to one specific lane. You have to be able to capitalize elsewhere, and they just simply were not able to do that. But let's talk about what TL did right. Got to talk about Bwipo, because he was the one who received pretty much all of the resources on TL's side this game. I said he was a lot better on tanks and that he's been more consistent on tanks, and that's where I would expect TL to go. TL go in the complete opposite direction, and they pick him Jax to be able to try and punish the Aatrox pick coming out from Impact. I definitely understand the idea of this. This is something I've praised a lot in the LPL. We've seen it throughout the LPL playoffs as quote-unquote a counter pick, as something that can pull the Aatrox out of those teamfight situations where he wants to create that divide in between the front line and the back line, pull him out into the side lane, create either a numerical advantage for your team, or theoretically create a situation where Aatrox does have to go and help and no one can really stop the split push. And so I definitely get the idea of the pick. However, Bwipo is incredibly aggressive, and this is something that can backfire really easily, and TL knows that, so they just decide to invest literally everything they have into the top lane. Santorin basically lives up there, which I don't hate. Like, I don't hate as an idea, especially if Inspired's not going to do anything else to stop that, but Santorin basically lives up in the top lane in the early game here, getting Bwipo an advantage. Bwipo does die a couple times, so you definitely gotta look at him for that, but he does get Bwipo an advantage here, and he is getting really strong on the Jax. And then just to further compound the issue, you have Core JJ roaming up on the Nautilus to be able to create plays in the top lane, being able to secure Rift Heralds over and over and over again, and then eventually being able to translate that lead into Dragon pressure, which did end up happening eventually. And a lot of that Dragon pressure, like I said, Bwipo, Santorin, Core doing a lot of good work up there. A lot of that Dragon pressure was due to Hansama playing really, really well on the Seraphine. This is a pick that we've seen him go to time after time on Team Liquid. This is something they were very familiar with in the regular season split, because Danny is stealing the Jinx here, which I think is a little bit troll. Jinx is not strong enough to steal. I honestly would be fine just leaving him on the Jinx. Really not all that concerned by it, but Danny feels like he needs to pick that up. Hans goes to the Seraphine, and if you're thinking, well, TL invested a ton into the top side, that should mean EG should be able to get a lot back on the bot side, really playing around the dragons, really playing around, taking advantage of a Seraphine basically by herself in that lane to dive her. Well, they couldn't. Hansama was simply just better than them in this game. He played really, really well. He outplayed Danny and Vulcan in the 1v2, and even when they brought Inspired, Hans basically had that sixth sense. He had a lot of good vision as well, but basically had that sixth sense to be in a good spot in a lot of the times. He was really influential towards why this game was so easy for TL, because it could have been very, very simple for him to just be pushed up and to be playing aggressive and to not really be able to compete with the 1v2 or get dove under tower, because he's not able to push out the lane. He's not able to create his pressure on his side, and you're basically just trading sides of the map. But he played it so well to the point where TL could invest a ton into topside and really not lose all that much in the bot side other than a few dragons, not really any kills or major gold. And so that was really impressive, I think, from Hansama. But the player of the game, in my opinion, a pretty easy choice here, gonna go to Core JJ on the Nautilus. Like I said, made a really big impact in the early part of the bottom lane here, making sure that Hans was in a spot where he could be successful on his own, and then just did what Core does best, and he roamed. He was everywhere on the map. Top lane, Rift Herald, he was making plays with the Talia around the map. It was really impressive, and this really felt like a 2021-2020 Core JJ return, which is exactly what I've been wanting to see all year long. I want to see him on these champions that can go around the map and really influence these lanes in a similar way to what we're seeing a lot of the mid laners impact right now. I think you can still flip that script and have the support be the one to make that impact. I don't think it's impossible for that to happen, which we saw in this game. Credit to Bjergsen as well. He finally gets to play Talia. This is one of his best champions of all time. He's proven that year after year after year, and it's been banned against him pretty much all year, but he finally gets to play it here in game number 2, and he takes advantage of it. Those W's for him are basically point and click. He is really, really smart about where to be and when to be somewhere on this champion, and I just don't really see a world in which you keep giving him the Talia. Overall, good game from TL, bad game from EG. Jojo really had a rough one. He had a very good game 1 here, but this is kind of the other side of the coin for Jojo. He's a very aggressive player that really likes to generate those early game leads. If he cannot do that in the mid lane, he is often going to suffer, and on the Sylas, he was really, really not good this game. Sylas is actually someone who I think is relatively okay into the Talia full stop, because he can roam, he can be proactive on the map, he can do a lot of different things. At 6, he can steal Talia's ultimate, and so he can be just as proactive in this matchup as Bjergsen is, but you do have to be relatively equal in gold to be kind of on that level, and unfortunately for Jojo, he just got so far behind in the early to mid game, so much so that he's going to get my dud of the game here in game number 2. But there were also moments where Danny, was definitely mispositioned. Like I said, there was a a big moment early or late in the game where he did not flash the seismic shove from Bjergsen that basically cost his life and basically cost the game. Not going to blame him too much. The game was a little bit out of reach at that point, but you definitely got to flash that. And then poor impact in the top lane was 3v1 the entire game against Bwipo, Santorin, and Core. At the very best, he was probably 1v2 most of the game. Definitely a rough situation to be in, but they had a game plan and they stuck to it, and the Jax got strong and was able to take over. So overall, impact didn't have the same kind of explosion that he needed to have. As for the outlook of these two teams, now we're sitting at 1-1. It's definitely a more interesting series now than it was before. TL is looking pretty good in this game. They definitely had an identity, and if they can keep on this identity, I really like the Taliyah pick. Hans played really, really well, and if Core is still roaming around the map, creating plays with Santorin, who has been TL's best player all year long, the TL team is kind of getting back to the form that I think a lot of people expected them to have going into the year. As long as they can maintain this, they should be the better team in the series. EG just needs to generate that early game lead that they're so used to, and a lot of that, like I always say, is on Inspired and JoJo to step up. This jungle mid duo has been absolutely crucial to the early game success of Evil Geniuses. Danny and Vulcan are very good players, but they aren't often creating plays pre-10 minutes. That is often on Inspired, and he hasn't had the best of games at the start of the series. He's going to have to step up if EG want a real shot at beating TL. But is that going to happen in game number 3? Who's going to take the 2-1 series lead, put themselves in a good position to close the series out? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Team Liquid. They are able to pick up the game 3 win and put themselves in actually a pretty good spot in this series, taking game number 3, going up 2-1. And a lot of it is, again, back off the fact that they are just better in the early game. They're just more talented, or at least that's what they're showing right now. I talked about Inspired and JoJo being the key pieces to EG's success in the early game. Well, Inspired's on the Trundle, which can work, but you're going into Poppy, and I don't love that matchup overall. Apparently, it's Trundle favored. Everybody keeps telling me that. I don't necessarily agree with it, but at the very least, it's a push. And you pick a Victor for JoJo. This is the guy that you really want to play around in the early game, that you want to invest in, and you give him one of the most passive early game picks you possibly can, while leaving up the most aggressive macro-oriented pick that the enemy mid laner plays super successfully. And I really just don't love this draft. You're not really making up for it with a bot lane carry, because you're picking up the Misfortune, who is relatively weak in the meta right now, at least in comparison to a lot of the top 80 carries, including Jinx, who isn't a top 80 carry. You're going a Leona, who I guess you're going for more of that Nautilus playstyle of wanting to roam around the map, right? You want to kind of take that away from what Core was doing, but Vulcan isn't Core. That's not his playstyle. He doesn't roam all the time and do all these things. He's very much a lane-focused player, and the Leona just wasn't all that effective in this game, nor is she in the meta right now. Overall, I just don't like EG's draft, really, at all, and I do like TL's draft. I think the TL put themselves in a position to really carry this early game, to really push forward with what they wanted to do. A lot of that because Poppy Taliyah is such a strong mid-jungle duo that you can really spread the wealth around the map. Poppy has so many ways to influence other lanes, and Santorin did have a good game, but really the MVP of this game was Bjergsen in the mid lane on the Taliyah, on one of his best picks that he has. You have to ban this pick out. It's been banned against him basically all year long. This and the Swain have clearly been the two things that have put TL on top, that have separated TL from the pack. There's a reason that those two are the most banned champions against TL, and it's because of situations like this. Obviously, the Draven involved in that as well, but I mean, just generally speaking, it's because of games like this where Bjergsen was able to completely take over the map on the Taliyah. Those seismic shoves, when Bjergsen is playing them, when Bjergsen is playing them, are basically point and click. He can hit anybody he wants, whether it's Danny on this Misfortune, who doesn't really have mobility outside of being a little bit faster on the W, whether it's Victor for JoJo Piyun here, and he also doesn't have any mobility, whether it's Trundle, who really doesn't have all that much mobility. It is very, very easy for him to just kind of do what he wants here, and even outside of that, he still has the ground for Aatrox to be able to suppress a lot of those flank plays that Impact might try to make, or even Trundle, like it dissuades him from trying to go full aggro and ingress on them, but Bjergsen had such a good early game that he was able to translate later. He basically made Danny's life a living hell in this game, and overall, like, this is how you play Taliyah. This is how you break the game. This is what we've been seeing players like Xiaohu, what we've seen players like Chovy be able to do a lot this year, which is take that mid lane pressure that they're able to create and spread the wealth across the map. Hans got super fed in this game on the Jinx, was able to generate a huge lead with him and the Lulu in the bot lane, and that's huge for this team. Bwipo was able to survive the early game against the Aatrox, in which case his team won, so he was able to become significantly stronger because he was getting gold basically for free in these team fights. Like I said, Santorin had a pretty decent early game. Overall, this is basically exactly what you wanted to see from TL. And my player of the game in game number 3, Bjergsen, was really leading the charge. As for Evil Geniuses, not the kind of loss that you wanted to see in this game. Like I said, I really don't like draft. You gotta take JoJo off of Victor. That is significantly too passive. You cannot be drafting Misfortune in this meta. I get it. You've gone to it a couple times, and I understand the idea of where this thing could go right if you want this big wombo team fight with, like, Victor ultimate dropping, Aatrox flanking on the other side, Leona kind of CCing everybody into this cluster where you can have Victor ultimate and MF ultimate, like, layered on top of each other. I get this big, like, wombo combo idea, but outside of that, you really don't have a ton of pressure, and you have to win. Like, Misfortune versus Jinx has to win in lane. Victor versus Taliyah has to win in lane, because you're just simply not going to create the same kind of pressure in the mid game that those champions are. And so if you're not ahead in CS, if you're not ahead in gold, you're going to be playing from behind, and that's exactly what happened in this game. Of course, positioning could have been a lot better, I think, for both Danny and Vulcan in this game, who it was a very hard choice of which one to give done to the game. I'm going to settle on Danny here in game number 3, but, like, you just have to position better. You simply have to be better in lane. Misfortune into Jinx is so ridiculously Misfortune favored early that for you to lose that matchup so heavily like you did, especially with the Leona into a Lulu, is pretty much unacceptable. And then Inspired, what happened, man? Like, where is the early game aggression? Where is the moves? Where's the plays? I get that this comp is a little bit slow, but, like, you've got to be the one that is going out there and making those plays and making those aggressive moves. It's not going to be JoJo on the Victor. It's not going to be Danny on the MF. It's got to be you, and he really just hasn't had that killer instinct in this series or really in the playoffs at all. I've been very disappointed with our MVP of the regular season here, Inspired, and I'm really hoping that he can step it up later in the series, or else EG's not really going to have that much of a chance come the rest of these games. So outlook-wise, you really need to see EG start stepping it up in the early game. Again, go back to what got you here. They've been a very good early game team. The thing that saved them throughout the season is that they can have good early games, but even when their early games don't go well, usually they can just go relatively even. And then you have a player like Danny who can really take over in the late game, but putting him on a Misfortune is just a waste of his talent, and it's a waste of the ideology that this team has used to get to this point in the first place. I want to see a complete overhaul of draft. Put JoJo on something super aggressive. Give Inspired Wukong. You banded out this game. Give it to him. Let him play it. He can play it really well. And then put Danny on something that can scale. Hell, if you want to take the Jinx, I'm okay with that. But the Zeri, the Sivir, try to get something here. Hell, even the Seraphine at this point. Something that scales into that next level that can help the team fight, because that's what Danny does best. Play to your players' strengths. Stop moving away from them. TL just needs to keep doing this. If they're going to give up the Taliyah, if they're going to give up the Poppy, just keep taking it. Bwipo on the Ornn, I've said, is his pick throughout the playoffs. If this is what you're going to get, just keep doing this, because it's clearly working. You don't have to change anything as long as they're going to continuously give it over. Now, I wouldn't expect EG to continuously do that. If Bjergsen needs to adapt, obviously, maybe you can open up a slot for a Zillion or some other more macro-oriented supportive pick, even something like a Sylas or an Ahri. I really like Bjergsen on, and I would expect them to go to that. And then, obviously, just keep what you're doing with the rest of this team. Santorin's had a really, really good playoffs. Let him create in the early game. Put Bwipo on tank so he can't run it down. Hans and Core have been winning lane recently. Let them continue to do that. Just maximize this. If you can do that, you're going to be going to Worlds. But going to Game 4, it's a must-win for EG. If TL can win this, they secure their spot at the World Championships, and they take out the #1 seed. But EG's got to win this to keep their hopes alive. Can we see another Game 5 out of these two teams? Well, the winner of Game number 4 is Evil Geniuses. They are able to take game number 4 here and push us to yet another game number 5 here in the LCS. This is the region of game 5s right now. I believe that's now 7 game 5s in 10 series in the playoffs, and the other ones have gone to 4. We haven't had a single sweep in the LCS so far. Absolutely insane how competitive these playoffs have been for pretty much every team involved. But let's go ahead and talk about EG's big win here in game number 4. Obviously, 2 main sticking points. 1, a top lane pentakill? We never see those. In fact, it's one of the, I think, like the second time ever in LCS history that we've gotten a top lane pentakill. Maybe the first? I don't remember. It's either first or second. You guys will let me know down in the comment section below, but still, like, absolutely insane. Impact gets a pentakill here on the Gangplank. Obviously, a pick that he's pulled out multiple times. We've already seen it in this series, but a great game from him overall with that pentakill. Really secured it, but as much as I gotta give credit to Impact, he got the pentakill. Great for him. They gave it to him, and they allowed him to get it, especially after how hard he got dominated in that game number 2. Absolutely disgusting. I'm glad that he got it for his mental, but you gotta give player of the game here, and a ton of credit, even on that pentakill, but just on the whole game, to Vulcan here on this Bard. What an unbelievable performance. This is one of the best performances of a support in any region in the playoffs so far this year. He was so ridiculously dominant in this game number 4. This is what you want out of Vulcan. Obviously, the consistency isn't really there for him all the time, but games like this prove to me that right now, he's the best support in North America, and I don't even think it's really all that close. He was so good in this game on the Bard, was setting up Danny over and over and over again for kills, setting up Inspired to be able to chase down and really pressure pretty much anybody on the enemy team, and then set up Impact for that pentakill really, really flawlessly. Some of these Qs were just miraculous. His ults are always phenomenal. Vulcan's Bard was exquisite in this game. Truly, I do not use this praise lightly. Like, this was a phenomenal game from Vulcan. Very, very clearly the player of the game in game number 4. Probably the best support performance we've seen in this region all year long. Pretty much with no exception. A great game from Vulcan, and really, really a star showing performance from him. But outside of Impact and Vulcan, honestly, they were fine. Like, they were good this game. Inspired had a much better early game, I think, compared to a lot of the other games in this series, mostly because I think Vulcan was super active and trying to make plays around the map, and Inspired, I think, definitely benefited from that. Same with Danny being able to benefit a lot from Vulcan's ability to create in that lane, and then he didn't really have to play all that aggro in laning phase. He could really just be the Misfortune that can move into the mid game and pressure a lot around the objectives, because the game was never really going to go that long, and Hansama was always behind, essentially from moment 1. We'll get to that. Jojo back on the Victor here, also a decent game. EG doesn't really change up their draft at all, like I said they would, but it wasn't really the pieces that they didn't change that did well. It was Impact and Vulcan that really created so much for this team, that the fact that they had, you know, the Trundle, the fact that they had, I don't even really get, the Trundle's a fine pick, but the fact that they had the Victor and the Misfortune didn't matter nearly as much because they were being set up in essentially perfect ways. The fact that Danny wasn't really creating a ton in lane against the Jinx as a Misfortune, where that's exactly what your role is in the game, like, that didn't matter as much because Vulcan was creating so much against that Jinx in lane that it really was basically impossible for TL to create a lot of success in that bot lane. But overall, great game from EG, really, really off of that phenomenal Bard game from Vulcan, and a really good game from Gangplank on, or from Impact on Gangplank, I should say. It was more than just the pentakill. I don't want it just to seem like, oh, we got a pentakill, so I'm giving him a lot of praise. Like, the pentakill was great, but he did beat Whippo. Like, he was stronger in that lane, and he played the early game really, really well. Obviously, Gangplank can have quite a bit of pressure into Ornn generally, but Ornn's just never really going to die in that matchup, and you just have to scale on Gangplank. And so overall, I can definitely see a world in which it could be a relatively even matchup, but Impact played it so well, was able to get that penta in the late game, and really made EG's dreams come true. As for TL, it sucks that you couldn't close it out here in 4, but the series is not nearly over yet. This was not a very close game. Like I said, you really just got beat by Vulcan. Like, Vulcan just completely beat everybody on this team, and it was really fun to watch, but you gotta give a lot of blame here to Santorin in the jungle. Probably the first game in this series where he's genuinely been just out-jungled by Inspired. A lot of that, again, was because the map pressure was so out of his state, but on the Wukong, you do have a lot of tools to be able to correct that, especially with Bjergsen on Taliyah. You can roam him around, essentially, with Santorin, try to create opportunities where you can find this Bard and pick him off. Really, they never did that, and they were never in a state to be able to punish Vulcan for a lot of these aggressive plays that he was making around the map, but Santorin's just got to be a little bit more active in that regard, especially if you're going to pick up something like Wukong. They definitely had a little bit better of a counter to Bjergsen's Taliyah this game. He still was, honestly, pretty good, at least in comparison to the rest of his team. He was hitting his abilities, but he wasn't nearly as ahead in this game, which was a problem. Obviously, a lot of the issues that the Taliyah pick caused EG in the early game of the last few games is the fact that her macro game is just so much better than whatever JoJo is going to be able to offer on Victor, that a lot of times she can get advantages without even really needing kills in the early game. But unfortunately here, the macro game was basically controlled by Vulcan again, and so Bjergsen just didn't have that same kind of impact on the Taliyah, and he gets to the mid to late game where Victor is able to outscale the Taliyah, and so you did end up getting a pretty much dream scenario if you're JoJo Pyun in this game. Bjergsen couldn't really impact the game. Bwipo lost in the top lane. Already explained that matchup a bit. Not really Bwipo's fault, but it did end up happening. And then the bot lane. I'm actually going to give my dud of the game here in game number 4 to Hansama. Mostly for the play that he made towards the back half of this game. He actually wasn't in that bad of a spot towards the mid game here. He had some gold on Jinx, certainly not enough to be able to compete with like the Gangplank, but enough gold to be able to be a little bit of a nuisance on the back line, especially if you got some peel, if you started finding some picks. There was definitely a way back into this game, but he goes for the like 4,000 Galaxy Brain play of trying to gank, or flank, I should say, EG on a team fight. And that's just never going to work if you're Jinx. He essentially just came around the back, started firing, and insta-died. And it was like, well, they now lose the team fight, and then they lost the game. And so that's kind of a play that you really just can't be making as an AD carry, even if you're in a relatively decent position, especially if you're in a relatively decent position. Hans just has to be smarter than that. It was not the call. I mean, you have a freaking Nautilus. Like, you have someone who can do this really successfully. You don't even need to flank. Like, if you want to flank, you have a Wukong, you've got a Nautilus, you've got Talia to wall off half the team. You've got so many opportunities, but Jinx is like the only one that should not be doing this. So, unfortunately for TL, they just kind of picked the worst of both worlds and ended up falling into that. But overall, not a great game from them, really. Definitely wanted to see more out of them. They just got outplayed in the early game and never could recover. This is EG's specialty. Win early and move on into the late game with that lead. This is what this team has done very consistently over the course of the year. It's the reason they went to MSI this year. It's the reason they won spring playoffs. They've really started to come back to this, not because of draft, but because of Vulcan. Like, Vulcan really unlocked himself in this game to the point where he basically single-handedly created a lead for Evil Geniuses. Inspired had a decent game too, but really he single-handedly created that lead that Impact then took and ran with into the late game. That's great, but maybe give more tools. Maybe put JoJo on a Sylas, or potentially the Talia itself. Like, give your team more tools to be able to do this more efficiently in the early game, and then put Danny on something that can take advantage of that. But right now, you're really just pigeonholing yourself. I think you won in spite of your draft this game because Vulcan was so unbelievably good on the Bard. It's not going to happen again. He's not going to get that pick in the next game. Under any circumstances, I'm not allowing him to have Bard again, but yeah, if EG can just win the early game, it's pretty clear that they're going to be able to win the game. But for TL, if they can survive and get to that midpoint game relatively even, they are better players, and they're better team fighters. That's really what it's about. Santorin, Bjergsen, they have been able to step up in the series and create a lot in the mid game. If they can do that again from a relatively even game state, TL does still have an opportunity and an advantage to win the series. It's all going to be about how the early game goes for both of these teams in game number 5. So, who is going to take the early game, and who is going to take the third and final spot for North America at the 2022 World Championships, and who is going to be watching it from home? Well, the winner of game number 5 was Evil Geniuses. They are able to take game number 5 and punch their ticket to the 2022 World Championships. It is absolutely heartbreaking for Team Liquid with this roster, this super team roster, to not be able to make Worlds is absolutely unacceptable. But we'll talk about them in a bit. Let's talk about EG in this game 5 first. It was a pretty good game, I think, overall from them. Not the cleanest. I would say game 4 was certainly a better version of this game, but they still were able to pull it off. They listened to me for the most part, maybe a little bit too much in the other direction, but it did work. This is a super early game comp, and I get it for EG. Like I said, the winners of the early game typically win this series, at least in favor of EG. If they win the early game, they are typically winning games, just period, end of story. And so they go all in. They go for the Renekton in the top lane. They keep the MF, and they do go to that Sylas that I was talking about to be able to match a lot of those pressure plays around the map. They allow Bjergsen to pick something like the Galio, which I think is super good, both for TL and for EG. A little less so for TL in this case, because I guess Galio is pretty good into Sylas in the 1v1 matchup, but once you hit 6, now Sylas can go elsewhere, and he can do it super free. This is why the Sylas into Talia matchup, in my opinion, is pretty Sylas favored, because he has the option to basically steal that ultimate from Talia, and in this case from Galio, and impact the fight just as much as they are able to, and he as a champion is just a little bit more impactful, a more impactful version of what Galio is right now. And so overall, really like this draft from EG. Definitely think it's risky because you're really indexing into that early game, and if you don't win, obviously you're not going to scale nearly as well as like an Aatrox, Jinx, Lulu comp, but at the same time, you have to rely on what got you to the dance, and that was early game aggression, and you played it. A lot of credit to JoJo in this game, who played really well in the Sylas, like I said. Credit to Inspired on the Poppy, who had another really good game. Santorin also played well this game, but Inspired definitely had a lot more map presence, I think, because EG's map state was significantly better, mostly because JoJo was just in so much of a better spot than Bjergsen was in this game. And then, player of the game, again, for the second game of the row, is going to go to Vulcan, this time on the Rakan. Rakan's obviously a pick that we're not seeing a ton of, but I still think he's pretty good in the meta overall right now. Definitely something that's worth playing, I think, generally. But it definitely fits into this comp, where I think a lot of what Vulcan has been doing is being able to create plays for the rest of his team. That's when Vulcan, I think, has been at his best, not only throughout the course of this series, but just in his time in the LCS. You put him on something like the Rakan, he's going to be able to do a lot of the things he did on Bard, maybe not as safely, but maybe a little bit more engaging and a little bit more effective in that regard. He was able to do that a lot. The Rakan Sylas double engage was really, really dangerous and something that TL absolutely had no answer for, and for that, Vulcan was a pretty easy choice for player of the game here in game number 5. He had a phenomenal series just in general. Danny back on the Misfortune, obviously, he feels very favorable towards that pick. I certainly don't agree with it, but hey, if you want to play it, go play it. I just don't think it really matches his playstyle all that much. He's not really a lane-dominant player, and MF definitely wants to win lane, especially against this Jinx matchup that we've now seen a bunch. Hansama lives and dies by the Jinx, and we'll get to that in a bit, but overall, I would say just a good game from EG. Vulcan, JoJo really stepped up. Inspired played a lot better. You have Impact on the Renekton. Basically has that same impact that something like the Aatrox does, at least in the early to mid game, and yeah, that's good. It all worked out. It all worked out in the end for EG. As for TL, it is an absolute disaster for you to miss Worlds this year. Not only are you easily the most expensive roster in the league, but there's a lot of talent on this team that I'm not sure is going to want to come back after not making Worlds. You have some contracts up, most notably Core JJ, that I'm just really not sure what you're going to be able to do with in the offseason. Obviously, still technically possible that he resigns here and you just run it back, but let's talk about this game first before we talk about where I think their offseason is going to go. Not a great game from them. Like I said, their draft was alright in the context of if we survive early game, we're going to get to that late game and Jinx is going to be able to win because we have a ton of frontline and a ton of peel for her. But you do have to survive the early game, and you really didn't do yourself a lot of favors in draft. You drafted Trundle, which is fine. Drafting Trundle into Poppy, certainly playable. I still think it's Poppy favored, but it is certainly playable. But then you bring out the Galio, and it's like, oh, okay, like, into Sylas especially, like, I get it. In the 1v1, it's probably effective, but you're just not going to have nearly the same kind of global impact, which is ironic because it's Galio, but, like, Sylas just essentially does what you do, but better now. And then you have the Jinx Lulu, which, again, is kind of foregoing a lot of pressure in lane into something like a Misfortune Rakan when you know they're going to invest down there. Just a very, very interesting draft. Hansama's going to get my dud of the game here again. His positioning in some of these back team fights was so poor, and it was so anti what Hansama was for a majority of his career. You could say that for him all throughout 2022, but especially in this series, like, it was Jinx after Jinx after Jinx after Jinx, and it's like, what happened to this team? Like, where did the Draven go? Where did the aggressive picks? You did really well on Seraphine in game 2. Where is that, like, I'm gonna win the game mentality? Now it's just like, yeah, I'll pick Jinx and I'll scale a little bit, and hopefully we get to that point. You have no agency as Hansama in these games, and you're playing like you do. You're playing Jinx out of position, up in the midline, and you're just getting taken advantage of by picks like Renekton, picks like Rakan, that can very easily get on top of you and basically make you a non-factor in a lot of these team fights. I really don't like how Hansama played this game. I really don't like how he played this series. And overall, I'm worried about Team Liquid. Like, the overall outlook of where this team is going to go after this loss is super questionable, because they could go in two completely opposite directions. They obviously could be somewhere in the middle as well, but there are so many things, and I'm sure I'll do an off-season preview video after Worlds or something where I explain what I think is going to be happening with a lot of these teams, but man, like, TL, you've got 4 players under contract. Everyone except Core JJ is under contract for next year, but I don't know how many of them are going to want to stay, or I don't know how many of them you're going to want to keep. You're clearly probably going to want to make changes. This TL team has never been shy to make changes after they have failed to reach whatever their goal ends up being, whether it's making Worlds and then getting out of groups, whatever they haven't been able to achieve. They have clearly been willing to, forego what they have in order to try and upgrade. I just don't know what that looks like for this team. There is a world in which they change almost every single member of this roster. There is a world in which they don't change any members of this roster. It's going to be an interesting offseason. They have the best academy team in North America as well. That's something worth noting. I'm not going to say they're going to straight up promote like Yeon and Ayla to the main roster, but at the very least, I don't think you can have Yeon and Ayla in Academy for another year. Somebody is going to call asking about them, and you're going to be able to get a clean probably like $3 million for those two players. Like, you can reinvest in this organization, especially if you're able to sell off, you know, maybe you don't think Hansama's the guy and you let Core go and you want a completely new bot lane. You can maybe sell Yeon and Ayla to somebody else, take that $3 million, sell Hansama, who somebody's going to want to play Hansama for sure, and then you can reinvest that into whatever AD carry support combo you think is going to upgrade you the most. There are so many plausible options for TL this offseason that I just have no idea what direction they could go in, and it's going to be fun either way. For EG, they are making their way now to Worlds. They still aren't done in the LCS, though. We're going to preview their matchup with 100 Thieves in just a second, but gotta give congratulations to this team. There were definitely moments throughout the playoffs where it felt like this team was not a Worlds team. I didn't even predict them to go to Worlds by the time they got to this series. I thought TL was going to be the better team to be able to take this, but they pulled through. The MSI representatives from North America are making a return at the World Championships, which is very, very good. It's going to be the organization's first time on the world stage, even going back to their time with, like, Crepo and, you know, all them. So Yellow Pete and everybody on the old CLG EU team when they came to North America. So really, really excited for what EG is hopefully going to be able to show. They're a dynamo team that I think definitely has the opportunity to surprise a lot of people, but they're certainly going to have to get their consistency down, and hopefully they can really refine their playstyle. Obviously, big love to Danny. Everybody go send love to Danny out there. Hopefully he's doing a lot better. I will say, I'll talk about this more in the preview, but he is officially stepping down for the rest of playoffs. I don't know if that will translate into Worlds, but he will not be playing for EG for the rest of these playoffs because of mental health stuff. You could see it on his face throughout the series. Even when they won, it was a complete, like, nothing for him. So I really, really hope he can recover, because he seems like such a good guy, and obviously he's so important to this team. You hope the best for him. So that notwithstanding, I'm really proud of this Evil Geniuses team, and I'm really excited to see what they're going to be able to do on the world stage. So that's going to do it for my overview and analysis of both of these series that I'm classifying here in round 3, both the winners finals and our determination for the final team for NA at Worlds. But we still have a series to cover, and that's the semifinals or the losers finals or whatever you want to call it here, between the number 1 seeded Evil Geniuses and the number 2 seeded 100 Thieves team. Obviously, 100 Thieves coming down from winners bracket, EG having to fight their way through here after losing their first series of the playoffs to Cloud9. Both of these teams being sent to losers bracket by the same team. Definitely an interesting matchup. Now, I want to make the caveat first and foremost that Kaori, I'm going to talk about him here, give a little bit of a scouting report. For those of you who have not watched Kaori play, he's going to be coming in to replace Danny. He's been EG Academy's ADC over the course of the year, and he has easily been Evil Genius's best Academy player. It really hasn't been all that close. He was the big carry for EGA throughout a majority of the year for a team that, quite frankly, struggled, but he did look good for a lot of this split, and it's because he does have some experience at a relatively high level. This is someone who did play in Turkey for quite a few years, very similar to someone like Luger in terms of career path. I don't think he's quite the same prospect that Luger was coming to the LCS for those who aren't familiar with him, but he is a pretty good player that I don't think is going to look completely lost at this level, but certainly isn't like top 3 quality, and is definitely not going to be the same level of his bot lane opponent, FBI. I think this matchup is going to be an incredibly interesting one overall, because if Kaori can survive, or hell, even surpass expectations with Vulcan, who was my player of the series for that series against Team Liquid, if those two can really gel and really surpass a lot of the expectations, FBI and Huhi could be in a little bit of trouble. Obviously, they have a very good laning phase, but they might be ones to take this lane for granted. I think a lot of teams would, but they might not be looking at Kaori and Vulcan as a very scary lane duo. I could see EG really surpassing and surprising a lot of expectations in that bottom lane by investing into them and making sure that Kaori is in a spot where he feels comfortable. A lot of good teams tend to do that with new players, and I could definitely see EG going that route. But overall, you have to give the edge here to 100 Thieves in terms of bot lane pressure, just because Kaori's not played a single LCS game, and now he's in semifinals. As for the mid lane matchup, definitely an interesting one. I think throughout most of the year, I would have told you this is very easily a JoJo Pune favor matchup, but Abadage has really been coming into his own in the last few series. He wasn't able to keep up with Jensen through the last few games, but he really dominated him in the first few. I think Abadage really just is a game-by-game player, and luckily for him, JoJo is very similar. Both of them have their good games and have their bad games. I think this is a matchup one of the first ones that I'm officially going to call a push. I think whichever one is better per game is really going to depend not only on draft, but just on which one shows up in that game. It's going to be an incredibly interesting one. And then you've got the top lane matchup, Someday versus Impact, the two most stable top laners in the region, without a doubt. Well, at least you would have said that before this split, where Impact has definitely been a little more disappointing, but he just had a very good series against Team Liquid where he really was better than Whippo for a majority of it. Someday, however, the best top laner in the region. And so it's going to be hard for me not to give the edge here to 100 Thieves, but I can see a world in which neither of them really have all that much of an impact, pun intended, on the series as a whole. I think both of them are good players, good enough to make sure that neither of the other one gets a gigantic lead. But that basically just leaves us with our key matchup of the series, and that is going to be our jungle matchup here between Inspired and Closer. Now, definitely an intriguing matchup between these two because both of them you would have thought were the heartbeats of the team's early games that they played through. Inspired, obviously, the MVP. Closer, somebody who's been an MVP in the past and really was a huge reason this team won the LCS last year. But both have kind of been taking a turn for the worse throughout the playoffs so far, at least in comparison to a lot of their contemporaries, most namely players like Blabber, players like Santorin, who really stepped up and started to carry their teams from the jungle. Inspired and Closer kind of took more of a step back. I think if one of them can regain their form in the same way that they had either in the regular season for Inspired or last year for Closer, it is certainly going to be a completely different story. Look at the stats that Inspired has. First in KD, third in damage per minute. I know he's 9th in first blood percentage, but that's because he's actively letting his laners generate a lot of those leads. And then Closer's just not nearly on that same level. He's really, really low in terms of damage per minute, damage percentage, KP percentage. We know that Closer can be a carry player. He just needs to show it in 2022 instead of 2021. And so I very much think that this matchup could be very volatile and could very much sway the direction that these series have gone. Jungle is such an important position in the meta right now. If they can generate leads, especially for like the bot lane, that's going to be very volatile in this matchup. I can see a situation where either of these teams comes out on top, mostly due to these two players. But it's going to be a fun series either way. I'm very, very, very excited to watch it. And really, can you ask for more than the 1 and the 2 seed facing off for a chance to play the 5 seed in the finals? Like, great storyline that we have here, and I'm really, really excited to see who ends up coming out on top. All right, that is going to do it for my Round 3 LCS overview and analysis of both of the series we got, as well as my preview of the upcoming Losers Finals to see who will be taking on Cloud9 in the LCS Finals. Now it's only time for predictions. 100 Thieves, Evil Geniuses, who do I got in this series? Well, I think it would have been very much more interesting with Danny in here, but with Danny gone, I think this has got to be pretty favored in 100 Thieves direction. I think they have to be the team that I think a lot of people are looking at to be able to take a series like this. Obviously, I think Kaori coming in could surprise a lot of people. I think he is a little bit better than some people are giving him credit for right now, but FBI should be able to take care of that matchup smoothly. And even if someone like Closer doesn't have the same kind of series that he's been able to have, I think Someday is a win in the top lane. I think Abadage on a good day is a win in the mid lane. I think FBI and Huki are a win in the bot lane. They should have pretty much every lane covered at that point. And so I could definitely see a world in which 100 Thieves is just able to take this game in 3 or 4. However, if EG was able to completely turn it around, I wouldn't be shocked because there is a chance that Inspired does wake up and become the regular season version of himself. I'm not going to say that that's super likely, but it is definitely possible. For context, even with Danny, I probably would have picked 100 Thieves in this series. And so 100 Thieves in 3, 100 Thieves in 4, I think that's probably my 2-game range. If it ended up being something else, I wouldn't be too shocked, but EG winning would definitely be a little bit of an upset, at least to me. But that's going to do it. That was the video. If you guys enjoyed, please go ahead and leave a like. It really does mean a lot for the channel, obviously, for the LCS content. This is kind of the conclusion of my every single day uploads that we've been having over the past, I don't know, like 7,000 months. It feels like the last month or so I've been posting every single day, a lot of times multiple times per day. I'm finally going to have a day off tomorrow, so I'm going to have a ton of time to read you guys' comments in the comments section below. Let me know how you feel, not only about the 2 series we covered today, but who do you expect to win in 100 Thieves and Evil Geniuses, and who do you see taking the LCS trophy at the end of it all? Obviously, we're going to be doing another video in between now and the finals, but definitely something I'd like to hear you guys' opinion on below. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.